The coordinates were wrong by 400 meters. I know that now. At the time, I only knew that the ridge I had been mapping for 3 days had a drainage anomaly along its northeastern face that did not match the survey folio compact logistics had given me, and that I had a professional obligation to walk the line myself before filing a route variance report. The Threshketh resupply corridor had been causing delay problems for 2 years. Somebody had to go out there and measure the actual ground instead of trusting 17-year-old survey data. That somebody was me, because I had been doing this kind of work for 22 years and nobody else in the contractor pool wanted the outer margin postings. I understood why they did not want them. The outer margin postings were cold in the morning, and the terrain was difficult, and the folio data was routinely wrong, and you ended up walking a great deal of basalt shelf with a notebook when you could have been filing comfortable reports from a terminal in a warm building closer to something resembling civilization. The pay differential did not adequately compensate for this. I was aware of that, and I took the postings anyway, because inaccurate data produced routing errors, and routing errors produced delays, and delays cost people things they needed, and someone had to fix it. So I walked the ridge. The entry point was a gap in the basalt shelf, maybe 3 meters wide, where the drainage channel from the plateau cut south before looping east. I came through it from the north side at approximately 7:40 in the morning, stepping down into the channel bed, consulting my notebook, measuring the gradient against my reference stakes, and I looked up and saw 400 soldiers staring at me. They were not in formation. That was the first thing I noticed, because a unit in formation would have told me something different about the situation than a unit mid-routine. They were distributed across the base floor in the natural pattern of a garrison running its morning schedule, some near the equipment bays on the western side, some crossing between structures with the particular purpose of people who know exactly where they are going, some standing in pairs near what appeared to be a briefing annex along the northern wall, one group running maintenance on a vehicle I did not recognize. They were tall, 7 feet, most of them some taller. Pale blue-gray skin, close-cropped hair, dark eyes, armor that caught the flat morning light in ways that made me want to note the material composition. They were all female, which I knew from the Velorvath sovereignty's documented military structure, because I read the briefing materials compact logistics provided, and also because the Velorvath 4th Frontier Division was not a secret. It was simply not mapped at these coordinates, and they were all, to the last soldier, looking at me. Nobody moved for about 4 seconds. I looked at my notebook. I looked at the drainage channel behind me. I looked at the base spread out before me, which was not on any map compact logistics had provided, which meant it was either very new or very intentionally unmarked, and either way the northeast drainage anomaly I had been tracking had just become significantly more interesting from a survey documentation standpoint. I put a mark in my notebook at the top of the page. Entry point confirmed off folio. Basalt gap coordinates to be corrected in variance report. Installation present at this grid section, not shown on compact folio, significance to be assessed. Then I made a note about the drainage channel gradient, because it was right there in front of me, and the information was accurate and measurable, and I had not walked 4 kilometers over basalt shelf in the morning cold to go home with an incomplete log entry. One of the soldiers near the equipment bays said something in Velorvath that I did not catch. Another answered her in a tone that sounded like assessment rather than alarm. Neither of them moved toward me yet, which told me the unit's first instinct was to assess before acting, which was, in my experience, the instinct of disciplined soldiers rather than nervous ones. I wrote down the gradient figure. I wrote down the channel width at the entry point. I wrote down the fact that the basalt formation on the south side of the gap was a different color than the north side, which implied a different composition, which would matter for load-bearing analysis. Then I stepped out of the channel onto the base floor, because standing half, in the channel was not going to make the situation clearer, and I wanted to see the northeastern face of the installation's terrain relationship to the drainage system. The movement toward me started then, steady, deliberate, not panicked, which told me these were disciplined soldiers and not a mob, which was the most reassuring thing I could have observed at that moment. About 12 of them converged from different angles across the base floor. The others held position but oriented fully toward me, which meant I was, functionally, the object of 400 people's complete attention. This was not a comfortable feeling. I had been the object of a great deal of attention over 22 years of outer margin contracting, border crossings, territorial disputes, equipment failures in inconvenient locations, and I had learned that the most useful response to unwanted attention was to remain still, say exactly what was true, and not add to the situation by doing anything that required additional interpretation. I put my notebook in my chest pocket and stood still. The soldier who reached me first was not the largest, but she had the fastest assessment read. I could see it in the way her eyes moved across me without dwelling anywhere that suggested threat prioritization, which meant she had concluded I was not an immediate danger and was now working out what I was instead. She said something in Velorvath. I answered in Standard because my Velorvath was functional for route terminology and environmental measurements, but was not reliable under conditions that required precision, and this was a condition that required precision. I gave her my name, Rail Dunmore, my contractor registration number, the survey contract reference for the Threshketh route variance assignment, the fact that I had been tracking a drainage anomaly through a basalt gap and appeared to have arrived at an installation that was not on my survey folio. She looked at me for a long moment with an expression that I could read without knowing the language, because it is a universal expression, the look of someone who has had a great many things walk through a perimeter in their career and has never had one of them be this specific. I told her I was sorry for the intrusion, that the folio error was a compact logistics mapping problem and not intentional, and asked if someone could show me the northeast face of the drainage channel before I was escorted out. I still needed the gradient measurement from that side, and it would save me from having to return to this section, which would presumably be preferable for everyone involved. She looked at the soldier beside her. They had a short exchange. Then she looked at me again. "Come," she said in Standard, "Commander." I went. The base had the particular organization of a frontier installation that had been built for function and maintained with precision, not the decorative permanence of an inter-system garrison, but the working density of a unit that expected to be here for a long time and had made the place accordingly. The path from the entry point to the operations annex took us past the vehicle maintenance bay, a supply structure, a medical station that I noted had equipment I did not recognize but which appeared to be clean and well-maintained, and 3 different sections of what I took to be barracks or quarters. The soldiers we passed looked at me. Most of them had the same expression as the first soldier, not threatening, but deeply attentive, in the way of people who have processed an anomaly and are still categorizing it. The operations annex was set into the base's eastern wall, shielded from the flat basalt plain by a reinforced overhang. Inside it smelled of the Velorvath compound that their environmental systems used, slightly mineral, faintly warm, different from compact base air in a way that took some getting used to but was not unpleasant. The floors were pale stone. The walls had rack systems loaded with equipment I did not have clearance to examine and therefore did not look at directly. The light was indirect and even, designed to keep the space functional at any hour. The commander was at a long table covered in survey overlays and tactical folios when we came in. She did not look up immediately, which was either a power gesture or genuine focus, and the quality of the overlays visible from the door suggested genuine focus was the more accurate interpretation. The overlays were the kind of density that required real attention to track multiple coordinate systems overlaid, notation in Velorvath script, and what appeared to be a secondary notation system I did not recognize. She was someone who worked with primary documents, not summaries. She was taller than the soldier who had brought me, nearly 8 feet. I estimated, with the close-cropped hair of a field officer, silver-white at the temples against dark beneath, the kind of silver that comes from years rather than genetics. Her skin was the pale blue-gray of the high command tier I had seen in compact briefing documents, but never in person, and her eyes, when she looked up, were copper gold with the luminous inner ring specific to the Velorvath ruling caste. I had read about the inner ring. I had not understood until now that it made a quality of attention that was different from ordinary attention, steadier, more complete, the way a precision instrument is different from an approximation. She looked at me the way someone looks when they have assessed threats for decades, and have learned to complete that assessment quickly and accurately. I stood still. "Your name," she said, in standard that had no regional accent I could identify, which meant she had learned it from multiple sources rather than one. I gave it to her, and my registration number, and the survey contract reference, and a precise account of how I had come to be standing in her operations annex, the drainage anomaly on the northern face, the gradient measurements showing a variance from the folio data, the decision to walk the channel personally rather than file from vehicle range as my predecessors had done, the basalt gap, the incorrect folio coordinates. I did not minimize any of it or add anything to make it sound better. The situation was what it was. An accurate description of it was more useful than a managed one. She watched me through all of this with no change in expression. "You are aware," she said, "that you entered a restricted Velorvath sovereignty military installation." "I am aware of that now," I said. "My folio did not show an installation at these coordinates. I would like to note that for the record, because the folio error is significant. A resupply contractor following the Threshketh route in ordinary conditions could repeat this entry without any intention of trespass. The gap is not marked, the folio is wrong, and the drainage channel leads directly through it." She considered this. "You are concerned about future contractors." "I am concerned about the folio," I said. "The contractors are the consequence of the folio." She looked at me for a moment that had a different quality to it than the preceding ones. Then she said something to the soldier who had brought me, a short instruction, and the soldier made the hand-to-chest gesture and left. The commander sat down at the table. She indicated the chair across from her. I said, "Tell me about the drainage anomaly," she said. I told her. I had my notebook, and I opened it to the measurements I had taken on the northern and western faces of the channel, and walked her through the gradient variance from the folio data, the implications for load-bearing vehicles in wet season conditions, and where the routing protocol would need to be adjusted if the variance was consistent along the full channel length. She listened without interrupting. She asked one question about the vehicle load specifications I was working from, specifically the weight class assumed in the folio's original routing data, and I answered it from the contract specification notes at the back of my notebook, and she did not ask another question, which meant the single question had given her what she needed. "The folio data is 17 years old," I said when I had finished. 18, she said. And she said it with the particular precision of someone who knows the date, because they have lived with the consequences of the gap between that date and today. "You know the survey," I said. "The Velorvath survey of this section predates the compact folio by 6 years and has been updated twice since," she said. "The drainage channel shifted after the Thresh marginal seismic event, which occurred 18 years ago. The northeastern face is now 6 degrees off the original survey line. The wet season runoff load is approximately 40% higher than the compact folio indicates." I had my notebook out before she finished the second sentence. 40%. 42 in a high runoff year, she said. 38 in a low runoff year. The average is approximately 40. I wrote this down. She watched me write. You are still working, she said. The data is accurate, I said. I should record it. She looked at me with an expression I could not entirely categorize, not hostile, not neutral, something more attentive than either. Then she said, my security officer will need to verify your contractor registration and contact Compact Logistics to confirm the survey authorization. Standard protocol. It will take approximately a day, possibly two. Of course, I said. The contact number for the Compact Logistics Outer Margin Survey Division is in my folio. I can write it down. I wrote it down and handed it across the table. She took it and read it and put it where documentation goes when it is accurate and noted. You will remain on base until verification is complete, she said. I still need the northeast gradient measurements, I said. She looked at me. I can take them while I am here, I said. If that is permitted, it would complete the survey log and I would not need to return to this section of the corridor later, which would presumably be preferable for the base's routine. There was a moment of silence that I suspected was not neutral. My operations officer will accompany you, she said. She will show you the northeast face. Thank you, I said. She looked at me again with that expression, steady, attentive, in the process of forming a category for something that did not fit the existing ones. Most individuals who enter this installation without authorization, she said, are in significantly greater distress at this point in the conversation. I can see why, I said. It is a large installation. 400 soldiers is a considerable reception. I paused. But you did not move against me when you had every reason to, which told me the unit's discipline was intact and the situation was being managed rather than reacted to. And you let me sit down, which was informative. She looked at me. Informative, she said. A commander who wants to intimidate does not offer a chair, I said. You offered a chair. So the conversation was going to be a conversation. I adjusted accordingly. She was quiet for a moment. Then, you read situations. I read terrain, I said. The same principles apply. Something behind the copper-gold steadiness moved, not visibly in her expression, but in the quality of the silence that followed. My operations officer will take you to the northeast face, she said. Complete your measurements, then return here before the evening hour. Yes, I said. I stood up. Rail Dunmore, she said. I looked back. The notebook, she said. You wrote in it while surrounded by 400 soldiers. The gradient was right there, I said. It would have been wasteful not to. She did not say anything to that. But the something behind the copper-gold steadiness moved again. And this time, it was in the direction of something that was not quite amusement, but was close enough to share the same neighborhood. The operations officer was named Velsorn Ethril Keen, and she was approximately 7 feet 2, approximately my height in the sense that I would need to stand on a surveying step stool to look her in the eye, and she had the particular patience of someone who had learned it from long practice rather than natural disposition. She walked the northeast face of the drainage channel with me for 2 hours without once suggesting I should work faster. The northeast face confirmed everything. The 6-degree deviation from the original survey line was visible in the channel wall strata. You could see exactly where the seismic event had shifted the gradient, a clean fault line in the basalt at approximately 1.3 meters depth. The wet season flow marks on the channel walls were 2 feet higher than the compact folio's routing calculation assumed. The load-bearing implications for the resupply vehicles were significant and cumulative. Every wet season transit was operating above the safe load threshold for this section of the channel, which explained the 17 routing delays in 11 years without requiring any additional analysis. I measured all of it. I took reference photographs with my survey recorder. I sketched the strata profile in my notebook. I noted the flow marks and measured them at 6 different points along the northeast face, so the record would be replicable. Velsorn Ethereal Keen watched all of this from approximately 3 feet behind me, which was close enough to be present but far enough to be out of the way of the work, which told me she understood the difference. "How long have you done this?" she asked, while I was measuring the 5th flow mark point. "Root variance surveys, 22 years. On outer margin postings." "Mostly," I said. "The inner corridors are well documented. The outer margin routes are where the folio data drifts and the routing errors accumulate. That is where the work is needed." "And you take the postings because the work is needed," she said. "I take the postings because the data is wrong and I can fix it," I said. "The reason the data is wrong is that it is easier to file from vehicle range. The reason it stays wrong is that no one prioritizes sending someone to walk the channel. Once you walk it, the problem becomes obvious. The solution usually is to." She was quiet while I measured the 6th point. Then, "You walked the channel alone, 4 kilometers over basalt shelf in the morning cold with a notebook." "The survey recorder also," I said. "Of course," she said. A pause. "The previous 3 contractors who surveyed this section filed from vehicle range." "I know," I said. "Their data is in the folio. You can see where the drift begins. About 8 years ago, the 3rd survey, the gradient figures start to flatten. That is what vehicle range filing does to terrain with this degree of slope variance. The instrument averages across the channel width instead of measuring the actual face. Over time, the average drifts from the actual condition." She said something in Velorvath, quietly, not directed at me. I caught most of it this time. It was approximately. "He knows exactly what went wrong and exactly when. He has been reading the wrong data for long enough to understand it." "Yes," I said, "because it was accurate." She looked at me. "You understand Velorvath?" "Functionally," I said. "Route terminology and environmental measurements, mostly. I have been on outer margin postings that border Velorvath sections for 11 of my 22 years. You absorb the language at that range." "You did not tell the commander that." "She did not ask," I said, "and my Velorvath is not reliable enough to have that conversation in. Standard was safer." She looked at me for a long moment. "You are managing the communication risk." "I was being accurate about my capabilities," I said. "That is a form of risk management." We walked back to the base in the late morning, and I had everything I needed from the northeast face, and the survey log for the Threshketh corridor was, for the first time in at least 8 years, going to be actually accurate. Verification took 2 days. Compact Logistics confirmed my authorization on the first day, but the Velorvath sovereignty's territorial protocols required a second verification through their own diplomatic channel, which was standard, and which I understood and did not object to. They gave me a section of table in the base commons near the east wall, and I worked. The base commons was a long vaulted space with pale stone tables and overhead lighting panels, and the ambient noise of a unit of 400 people maintaining purpose. Soldiers passed through on schedules I could partly decode from the timing, meal cycles, maintenance rotations, briefing windows, the particular pattern of a frontier garrison that has been in place long enough to have routines that work. I stayed at my table and did not go anywhere I was not directed to go, and did not look at anything I was not supposed to see. And by the afternoon of the first day, the soldiers passing through had filed me under present and accounted for, and not a problem, and went about their work. I went about mine. What I had was a survey log that was almost complete but not entirely, and a route variance report that needed to incorporate the northeast face measurements into a coherent routing recommendation. What that routing recommendation required was an understanding of the full drainage pattern, not just the sections I had measured, but the plateau-level pattern that produced the channel's behavior at the section level. I could approximate this from what I had measured, and from what the commander had told me about the seismic event, but an approximation was not the same as a measurement, and I did not file approximations if I could help it. From the east windows of the commons I could see the basalt flat, and above it, the eastern edge of the plateau. The plateau's drainage relationship to the channel was visible from this angle in a way that it was not from ground level. I could see the gradient in the plateau's eastern face, the slight eastward tilt that directed the runoff toward the channel, and I could estimate from the tilt angle and the visible erosion pattern what the wet season flow volume would be. It was an estimate from an observation point rather than a measurement, which meant I would need to note it as an estimate. But it was an accurate estimate from a good observation point by someone who had been measuring drainage channels for 22 years. I sketched the plateau profile in my notebook and made the estimate and noted its source, and moved on to the routing implications. The commander came through the commons twice each day. I noticed this the first day and confirmed it the second, a regular circuit, at consistent intervals, the kind of pattern that is both a command practice and a genuine interest in what is happening in the space. She moved through the room with a quality of attention that made the room orient toward her without instruction, not from fear, but from the particular trust a unit develops for a person whose judgment has been accurate over time. She passed my table the second morning and stopped. "Your verification will complete today," she said. "You should be cleared to leave by mid-afternoon." "Thank you," I said. She looked at the table, my notebook, the folio pages, the sketches I had made from the east window, the routing recommendation draft taking shape in the margins of the survey contract pages. "You have been working," she said. "The corridor survey report is due to compact logistics in 4 days," I said. "The table near the east window is a good observation point for the plateau drainage profile. I have been using it." She picked up the plateau profile sketch. She looked at it for a moment. "You did not go where you were not permitted," she said. "No, but you used what was visible from where you were sitting." "That is how surveying works," I said. "You take accurate measurements from accessible positions. You note what you cannot directly measure. You document the gap between what you know and what you are estimating, so the person reading the report knows which is which." She set the sketch down. Then she said something that I did not expect. "Would it be useful," she said, "to see the Velorvath survey of this plateau section, the full survey? It covers the entire Threshketh corridor drainage basin." I looked at her. "It would be useful," I said carefully. "It is 18 years more current than your folio," she said, "and it covers the plateau-level drainage pattern you are trying to estimate from the window." "Yes," I said, "it would be very useful." She went away and came back 23 minutes later with a physical map, large format, printed on the kind of material that preserves over long storage, the original rather than a copy, which told me this was a document of genuine importance to someone on this base, and that bringing it to the Commons table was a considered decision rather than a casual one. She laid it out on the table and oriented it to north, and pointed to the section covering the corridor I had been surveying. I looked at it. Then I looked at my notebook. Then I looked at the map again, and did the kind of cross-referencing that requires the brain to hold 2 images simultaneously and find the relationship between them. "May I said. She nodded, and I put my notebook beside the map and started comparing. The Velorvath survey was not just more current. It was a different approach to the terrain. The compact folio used standard corridor routing methodology, measuring along the route line itself and at fixed perpendicular intervals. The Velorvath survey measured the watershed, the entire drainage basin from the plateau crest to the channel floor, at enough data points to reconstruct the full 3-dimensional flow pattern. The compact methodology told you what the ground looked like along the route. The Velorvath methodology told you what the water did, which was a more useful thing to know when water was the primary variable in the routing problem. I sat with that map for 3 hours. The commander sat across the table for portions of it. She went away twice and came back, the way someone comes back when they have work elsewhere, but are finding a reason to return to a particular location. When she was there, she answered the questions I asked, and did not answer things I did not ask, which was a discipline I found more valuable in a conversation partner than any amount of additional information. She answered accurately. When I asked about the seismic event, she gave me the date, the magnitude as measured by the Velorveth monitoring network, and the resulting gradient shift in decimal degrees. When I asked about the wet season flow volume, she gave me the high year and low year figures without rounding. At the end of the 3rd hour, I had a route variance report that was going to fundamentally revise the Threshketh resupply corridor's wet season protocol. Load weight limits reduced, seasonal timing adjusted. A routing option along the plateau's western edge that avoided the channel entirely in high runoff years. Estimated reduction in annual delay, 3 to 4 weeks. I said this. The commander looked at my notebook. How much of the revision comes from the Velorveth survey? Approximately half, I said. The watershed approach gives the pattern. My measurements give the current condition of the specific features. Neither is sufficient alone. The survey is 18 years old in its measurements, even if the methodology is correct, and my measurements cover sections of the channel but not the full watershed. Combined, they are accurate. Separate, they are each only half the picture. She was quiet for a moment. Compact logistics does not know the full picture requires both sources. They have not had access to both, I said, and they did not know the Velorveth survey existed at this resolution, so they did not know there was a gap in their picture. And you will report both sources. I will report the data and its sources, I said. I will note that the Velorveth Sovereignty maintains a watershed-level survey of this section that is significantly more current and methodologically more comprehensive than the compact folio, and that future routing analysis for this corridor should incorporate both. That is the accurate statement of the situation. That is also a diplomatic statement, she said. It is an accurate statement that happens to have diplomatic implications, I said. I cannot make it less accurate in order to make it less diplomatic. The situation is the situation. The something behind the copper-gold steadiness moved again, more than before. Not quite a smile, but getting closer to the territory where smiles live. Rail Dunmore, she said. Yes. The 4th compact contractor to survey this corridor in 18 years. The first to walk the drainage channel, I said. The folio notes indicate the previous 3 filed from vehicle range. They did. That is why the data drifted, I said. It is not a criticism of the contractors. Vehicle range filing is faster, and the terrain is difficult, and no one told them the method was producing inaccurate results, because the inaccurate results still looked plausible at the scale compact logistics was examining. The error only becomes visible when you walk the channel and see that the folio and the ground do not match, which is why someone needed to walk it. And that someone was you. It happened to be me, I said. It should have been someone 18 years ago, but that is a historical observation and not particularly useful. She looked at me for a long moment. The protocol between the Velorveth Sovereignty and compact logistics for this corridor, she said carefully, has not been updated in 18 years. Yes, I said. A revised protocol incorporating both survey datasets would produce a routing standard that is accurate to current ground conditions. It would, I said. It would also require a formal diplomatic agreement between the sovereignty and compact logistics to share survey data, which is a diplomatic process and not a surveying one. I am a surveyor. And yet, she said, the document you have in your notebook is the basis for that diplomatic process. if either party chose to begin it. The data is there, I said. What either party does with it is not my decision. She was quiet. But the data will be in the report, I said, accurately sourced. Any party that reads the report will know the basis exists. She looked at me for a long moment. The base ran around us, the steady sound of 400 people at work, the equipment bays, the soldier schedules cycling through their afternoon patterns. Outside the east windows, the basalt flat was catching the afternoon light, and the plateau above it was clear and enormous and very still. My division has operated this frontier section for 11 years, she said. In 11 years, no compact contractor has walked the drainage channel. 3 came before you. They filed from vehicle range and returned with data that did not match the ground, and the routing delays continued, and no one in compact logistics knew enough to ask why. I know, I said. I read the delay reports in the contract briefing. 17 incidents in 11 years. The pattern was consistent enough that someone should have been sent to walk the channel 8 years ago, when the drift became visible in the folio figures. But the drift is subtle at folio scale, and you have to know what to look for. You knew what to look for. I have been reading wrong folio data for 22 years, I said. Eventually, you develop a sense for the shape of the error. She was quiet for a long time. I let it be quiet. There was nothing I needed to add, and the silence was not uncomfortable. The division assembly meets this evening, she said, before you depart. I looked at her. It is a routine assembly, she said. I had been on enough frontier postings to know what a Velorvath division assembly was. I had read about them in the briefing materials. Not social, formal. The kind of gathering a unit holds when something has happened that the unit needs to know about collectively, or when a commander wants something on record in a way that is witnessed by everyone who is part of the unit. I will attend, I said. The assembly space was the largest interior I had seen on the base, a vaulted hall with pale stone walls, and the flat, even overhead lighting of formal military proceedings. 400 soldiers, arranged in rows with the kind of stillness that comes from years of practice. The commander stood at the front on a raised platform, not elevated enough to separate from the unit, but elevated enough to be visible to all of it. I stood near the east wall, in a position that Velsorn Ethrokeen had quietly directed me to, close enough to the floor's edge that I was within the assembly space, but not within the row structure. The commander spoke in Velorvath for the first portion. I followed approximately a third of it, enough to track the content. Operational matters, a personnel roster update, a scheduling adjustment for the Northern Patrol Circuit, a note about resupply logistics for the next 3 weeks. Standard command work, the kind of information that keeps 400 people operating as a unit rather than a collection of individuals. Then she shifted. She spoke 3 sentences in Velorvath and then said the same sentences in Standard, and the shift told me she was speaking for the record in both languages, which meant this portion of the assembly was going to be recorded, and the recording would be in both. This division has operated the Threshketh frontier section for 11 years, she said. In 11 years, the compact logistics resupply corridor that crosses this section has produced 17 routing delays in wet season conditions, resulting in supply shortfalls at the outer margin depots served by this corridor. In 11 years, no survey of that corridor has been accurate enough to diagnose those delays, because no one walked the ground. 400 soldiers were looking at her. The room had the quality of a space where everyone was listening, not because they were required to, but because they knew they were going to want to have heard this. 4 days ago, she said, a compact route variance contractor named Rail Dunmore followed a drainage anomaly through a basalt gap in the Threshketh channel and walked into this base. He had a notebook, a survey recorder, and a route variance contract. He was 400 meters off his folio coordinates because his folio was 18 years out of date. A shift in the room, the particular kind of shift when a professional audience hears a detail that is both precisely accurate and exactly as absurd as it sounds. He stood on the base floor, she said, with 400 soldiers of this division looking at him, and he made a note in his notebook. The room was very still. He then asked if someone could show him the northeast face of the drainage channel before he was escorted out. The stillness became something else, a kind of collective breath held. He spent 2 days at a table near the east wall of the Commons, she said, working. He completed the route variance survey using his own measurements from the northeast channel face, the plateau profile visible from the east window, and the Velorvath watershed survey, which I provided to him, because the data was more useful shared than held. She looked across the hall at me. The route variance report he will file with Compact Logistics will revise the Threshketh resupply corridor protocol for wet season operations. Estimated reduction in annual routing delays, 3 to 4 weeks. The report will also note that the Velorvath sovereignty maintains a watershed-level survey of this section that should be incorporated into any future corridor routing analysis. A note that will, if the relevant parties choose to act on it, form the basis of the first data-sharing protocol between the sovereignty and Compact Logistics for this frontier section. She paused. He did this, she said, because he walked the drainage channel instead of filing from vehicle range, because he was willing to record what he found, regardless of where he found it. Because when the situation required it, he acknowledged the gap between what the folio showed and what the ground was, and he worked to close it. And because when I asked whether it would be useful to see the Velorvath survey, he said yes, and sat with it for 3 hours and produced something that is more accurate than anything either survey produced independently. She turned to face the full assembly. The Compact sends many contractors to the outer margin postings, she said. I do not know how many of them would walk 4 kilometers over basalt shelf in the early morning cold because the folio data was 18 years old and someone needed to measure the actual ground. But this one did. And this frontier section is more accurately mapped because of it. She said something in Velorvath, a formal phrase, the kind of language used in official acknowledgement, in the register that the Velorvath military used when they were putting something on a permanent record. 400 soldiers made the hand-to-chest gesture simultaneously, fingers spread, palm flat, held for a moment. Not a salute. I had read about it in the Velorvath military briefing materials. It was the gesture used when a division acknowledged something that was going to be in the permanent record, something worth noting. I stood near the east wall. I put my hand to my chest. Velsorn Ethrokeen walked me out to the east observation platform after the assembly. The platform was a shelf of pale stone above the basalt flat, open to the evening sky, with the plateau visible to the north and the drainage channel visible below, cutting southeast from the basalt gap where I had entered the base 4 days ago. In the late light the plateau was amber, and the shadows were long, and the channel caught the light along its western face where the gradient shifted. From up here I could see the full drainage pattern in a way that I had not been able to see it from the ground or the Commons window, the full watershed, the plateau's eastern tilt feeding into the main channel, the secondary drainage paths that fed into it from the north, the basin structure that concentrated the wet season flow at exactly the section of the corridor that had been causing the routing delays. Everything was visible from up here. The entire problem was visible from up here, and the solution was obvious once you saw it. Route the vehicles along the plateau's western edge in high runoff years. Avoid the channel concentration entirely. I had already put this in the report. But I made a note about the view from the platform, because it was the clearest illustration of why the problem had persisted. The corridor routed through the lowest point of the basin, which made sense in the dry season, and was a compounding liability every wet season. And nobody had stood up here to see it because Nobody had been on this platform because the platform was on a military base that was not on the folio. "You are still making notes," said Velsorn Ethril-Keen. "The view from here explains the routing problem more clearly than any document I can file," I said. "I want a record of what it shows." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "The commander will be here shortly." I put my notebook away, because some things are a better use of attention than a notebook. The commander came out onto the platform a few minutes later. She had changed out of the formal assembly attire into a field jacket, the practical outer layer of a soldier who spends time in the cold, rather than a commander who receives reports from indoors. She looked more like someone who walked drainage channels in the morning cold than she had looked in the operations annex, which made her more legible to me, not less. She stood beside me at the platform rail and looked at the basalt flat. "The assembly is a permanent record," she said. "I gathered that," I said. "The acknowledgement, the gesture, goes into the unit's permanent log. It will be filed with the division record at the Sovereignty's Central Archive." "I did not know the specific function," I said. "But I understood it was formal." She looked at the drainage channel below us. In the evening light it was a darker line cutting through the amber flat, visible and clean, exactly what it was. "You responded correctly," she said. "I tried to respond accurately," I said. "I was not certain of the precise protocol." "Accuracy and correctness were the same thing in that moment," she said. We were quiet for a while. The basalt flat went darker as the light shifted. The plateau held the amber longer, it was higher, catching the last of the sun. "The report will go to Compact Logistics in 3 days," I said. "After that it is in their hands." "And the diplomatic note?" "It is in the report," I said, "accurately sourced. Anyone who reads it will know the basis exists for a data-sharing agreement. Whether they pursue it is their decision." She looked at me, "And if they do not pursue it?" "Then the routing protocol will be improved," I said, "and the delays will be reduced, and the corridor will be safer in wet season conditions. That is not a small outcome. That is what the survey was contracted to achieve." "But the full outcome," she said, "requires the data-sharing agreement." "Yes," I said, "it does." She was quiet. "If the agreement is pursued," she said, "it will require field verification of the combined survey data. Someone would need to walk the corridor again, the full corridor, both the sections I surveyed and the plateau sections that are currently estimated rather than measured." "That is correct," I said. "The contractor who conducted the original variance survey would be the appropriate person to conduct that verification," she said. "The continuity of the dataset would require it." I looked at the drainage channel below. In the growing dark it was becoming a suggestion of a line rather than a line. The kind of thing you had to know was there to see it from this distance. "A full verification survey of the Threshketh corridor and the Velorvath watershed section," I said, "would take approximately 2 weeks on the ground. One for the corridor proper, one for the plateau drainage basin." "Yes," she said. "And it would need to be conducted with access to the Velorvath survey data in situ," I said. "The comparison has to happen at the measurement points, not from a table in a compact office." "That access would be provided," she said, "if the agreement were in place." "I will note in the variance report," I said, "that a full corridor verification survey is recommended as the next step, to be conducted in coordination with the Velorvath Sovereignty's Frontier Division for this section, using the combined dataset methodology developed during the initial survey." She looked at me. "That is a very specifically worded recommendation," she said. "It is an accurate recommendation," I said. "If it also creates the conditions for a follow-up posting, that is incidental." The something behind the copper-gold steadiness had fully arrived now, no longer moving toward something, but having arrived there, warm and precise and steady in the same way she was steady. the kind of thing that had been there all along and had simply needed the right conditions to be visible. "Safe travels," she said. "Thank you," I said, "for the map, for the assembly, for letting me finish the measurements." "The measurements needed to be taken," she said. "You were the one who walked the channel to take them." "Someone had to," I said. "Yes," she said, "someone did." I turned to go. "Rail Dunmore," she said. I turned back. The basalt flat below was nearly dark. The plateau above it was still holding the last of the amber. She was looking at the channel, not at me, but she was speaking to me. "The wet season ends in 4 months," she said. "The northeast channel will require remeasurement at the start of the dry season, when the post-runoff gradient shift can be accurately assessed." "I will make a note," I said. "The observation platform," she said, "has a better view of the full watershed than any vehicle range position in the corridor." "It does," I said. She turned and looked at me. 4 months. 4 months, I said. I went down from the platform and across the base floor, and through the basalt gap in the Threshketh Channel, 400 meters northeast of where my folio said I should be, and I walked back across the basalt shelf in the growing dark with my notebook and a survey report, and a diplomatic note that was going to have consequences I could not fully anticipate, and a note in the back of the notebook that said Northeast Channel, remeasurement, 4 months, coordinate with Commander Keithra Ethais. Velorveth Sovereignty 4th Frontier Division, observation platform, 2 weeks minimum. Behind me, the base lights were visible over the basalt gap, steady and even, the kind of lights that stay on through the night because the work does not stop. The drainage channel was visible in the dark by its sound, the particular quiet of a cut in basalt where water has moved and will move again. I could feel the gradient under my feet even in the dark, the slight eastward tilt of the plateau's drainage pattern, the shape of the problem that had been there for 18 years waiting for someone to walk it. I made a final note about the evening gradient. The way the channel read in low light was different from how it read in the morning, which was information, which was worth recording, and filed it under the same heading as everything else from this posting. Then I walked home in the dark with accurate data and 4 months to wait, and that was, on reflection, not a bad situation to be in.